Laura and Chris, a misleading number has been put out into the public domain.
Oh, really?
And it needs to be corrected.
Quite
and
right.
It was put out by me on yesterday's newscast, available on BBC Sounds, where I'm
going to write to the Office for National Statistics immediately.
Yes.
And then maybe they'll write a quite wussy letter back because they didn't want to rock the boat too much. Anyway, that's a discussion for another day. Anyway, we're going to do episodes of Newscast live on Radio 4 on Saturday mornings for the duration of the election campaign. And I made this big announcement about it yesterday on Newscast on our podcast episode on BBC Sounds. But I got the time wrong.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And I got the time wrong in the worst possible way, because it was in a way that means I'd miss it and be late, because it's actually at 10:30 this Saturday. Normally, for like the rest of the campaign, it's going to be at 11 a.m. on Radio 4. Our first inaugural premiere episode is at 10:30. So turn your radio dials to Radio 4 at 10:29, and you'll then hear
I'm very
me
glad
and Laura.
that you corrected that, because hopefully it means that I won't be late. But you said it's a premiere. Are you going to dress up? Because I haven't got a cocktail dress, I don't think. I'm not feeling like red carpet ready. That doesn't happen in an election campain.
Oh, Laura, I can tell you're a TV person, because the thing is with radio, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. You can say you're wearing a ball gown and people are like, all right. But you know what is an innovation? Chris Mason, because he's not dashing around the country for once, he's got aftershave on. And it hasn't worn off because of a day of like sweating.
Well, also more to the point, I've got because of the D-Day commemorations, I've had a quieter day, which means, and this is dangerous, I have come in to do Newscast in something other than a suit and tie, and therefore the sort of, you know, the wardrobe that hasn't been sort of signed off and okay for TV actually features certainly on the TV version of Newscast, which is. Yeah, dangerous territory.
I feel like I've just come round to your house. Right, let's get on.
Terrible risk to take. Somebody's obviously going to resign in a while.
Right, let's get on with this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Laura not in the studio.
So, we're going to be honest, there's not been a massive, big political story in the election campaign today. So we thought we'd just run through some of the many stories that have been floating around kind of under the surface of the news today. And the reason, I mean, it's quite understandable why the politicians haven't been out in the battle buses is because lots of them were in northern France for the commemoration of D-Day. And then actually, when you look at the pictures, obviously the main thing is it's very moving, and you're just reminded of the sacrifice and all that the weight of history in the pictures, and it's been very well choreographed by the French. But also, one of the things you notice, that one of the key moments when all the big world leaders were there, Rishi Sunak, Chris, wasn't there. David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, was the pretend PM today.
Yeah, so Rishi Sunak has been involved in the various commemorations for much of the last couple of days, but wasn't there at that exact point when there were plenty of leaders sort of doing their thing and wandering about and saying a few things and meeting some of the veterans. And so, yeah, Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, mingling with the French President and the German Chancellor and the US President and all the rest of it. And, yeah, Rishi Sunak at that point, no longer there.
But I suppose, Laura, with Prime Ministers, duty calls all the time, and sometimes the duty isn't the kind of the world leader stuff.
Well, that's right. I mean, we should say he did make a speech today, so it's not like he sort of there for 5 minutes and then disappeared. But you're right, at some of the crucial sort of maximum moments of potent choreography, it was David Cameron who was actually there in his place. It's one of the things actually that Paddy is completely obsessed with this. We've talked about this a lot on the weekend newscast, that David Cameron, because of his former job, can sort of slip in and out of that role very, very easily. Some people might raise an eyebrow and say, oh, perhaps too easily. But, you know, as you say, actually, for prime ministers who are trying to run the country as well as run an election campaign, that is a challenge that they've got that actually the leader of the opposition doesn't have. And, you know, before too long, there's the G7 as well that I think the prime minister will be trying to cram in. And, you know, the small matter of still having to deal with red boxes and so on and so forth. But you're right, it does mean at this big moment of history, some of the snaps that we'll see in the papers tomorrow will not have the British current prime minister. They'll have the former prime minister. And I suppose there is something slightly awkward about that.
I have to say, I love the pictures on social media of David Cameron out campaigning on the doorstep and literally on someone's
That's
doorstep.
my favourite moment.
Oh, yes, on the recorded.
Through their doorbell camera.
Yes.
That is
We're
my
not
moment
in.
this week. We're not in. But it did make me wonder two things. Is one, were they in, but they didn't answer because they saw it was a politician?
Yeah.
But also, and it's something we've asked actually viewers and newsletter readers, and I'd love to know from newscasters as well, have people spotted politicians in their area and where have they been?
Yeah, the
because
geography
the places
of campaigning.
that absolutely. So if you see David Cameron turning up in Hampshire, where he was in this campaign, and you see Keir Starmer turning up in Gillingham in Kent, as he did on the first day, that tells us that the campaigns are running in very different ways, that the Tories are trying to shore up seats that might normally be completely safe, and Labour is trying to stretch their tentacles to plenty of areas that they haven't held for a long time. So do let us know. I'd love to know if anybody's spotted a politician in somewhere really funny or really interesting, or what have they said to you on the doorstep?
Yeah, Rishi Sunak was in Henley in Oxfordshire, of all places, the other day, which has been a Conservative seat for about 1 trillion years.
And that was another amazing moment, wasn't it, with the photobomb of the Lib Dems going up and down and spoke behind him.
Yes, it certainly was. Yeah, no, quite. And you know, the fact that the Lib Dems were there and the Prime Minister was there, these places are picked carefully. The time of the senior figures is precious. And it tells you something about where they conclude the battlegrounds are.
Also, I love it. Laura wants people to send in intellectually, editorially interesting sightings of politicians. I want people to send in funny videos from their doorbell cameras, because actually much of this campaign is quite retro and old-fashioned, I've been complaining about. But one of the innovations that we didn't really have 5 years ago was doorbell cameras.
What about, I reckon one up from a doorbell camera would be some dash cam footage, you know, with a politician crossing the zebra crossing or crossing the pelican in front of you.
Or being caught speeding like Ed Davey was this week.
Indeed,
Tut, 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 tut.
Yes.
Although a part of that was he said that he hadn't even got the fine the first time round, and so he would have paid it, or there was an administrative error.
There was
or
a bit of a
something.
paperwork cock-up on top of going rather quicker than he should have been.
Anyway, talking about money and paperwork, there's been a story about that for the Conservatives, because the businessman Frank Hester, who was a Tory donor, then he got into hot water for some comments he made about Diane Abbott that people thought were quite violent and quite racist. He's now a Tory donor again, Chris.
He is. So we knew that he'd given plenty of money, 10 million quid in the past. What we've found out with this latest set of declarations is that there was an additional £5 million in January, and then there was a further 150 grand in March, early March, March the 8th. And the reason that date matters, and the donation was formally accepted by the Conservatives about a week later on the 14th, is that is when that whole row about that recording with those remarks that you refer to was all over the news, and where Rishi Sunak and others were being asked, A, you know, will you condemn the remarks, and B, did I say A and B? I thought I said 1 and 2 then, yeah. B, will you give the money back? And they didn't give the money back. They never claimed that they would, by the way. But yeah, whilst that was swirling, they were accepting additional money on top of wads of the stuff that had been coming their way from Mr. Hester for quite a while.
Politics needs money. Politics during election campaigns needs lots and lots and lots of money. And while you might think, oh, well, a big party like the Tories has always got loads of cash and Labour's always got loads of cash from the unions, that's actually not how it works. Politicians and political parties have to work very hard to get their hands on the huge amounts of dosh that they spend in election campaigns.
Another thing that's been rumbling in the background and sort of making its way into the foreground occasionally for the Conservatives is their selection of candidates, because we're approaching the deadline for when people actually have to sign their papers to be standing as a candidate in their constituency. And newscaster Susanna has been all over this.
Hello, Newscast. Please can you explain the selection process and deadline for new candidates at the election? Has Rishi's surprise date caused a problem, particularly for the Conservatives? Thank you.
Which caused a rush, Susanna. That's what it's definitely caused. And to a greater or lesser extent, this happens at every election, because a lot of MPs will leave it very late before announcing that they're going to retire or go and do something else and all the rest of it. And sometimes they are encouraged to do just that. by their parties, because that means that there is a narrow window into which you can find successors or potential successors, and therefore potentially ensure that the people you want end up in those places, rather than there being a more long-winded process that might throw up people who you are less keen on. So we've been racing towards this deadline, which is on Friday, for the closure of nominations, when people have to, sign on the dotted line and say they want to stand for Party X or Party Y, or as an independent or whatever. And so what we've seen in the last couple of days, particularly with Labour and the Conservatives, is a rapid hurtle towards ensuring that they've got people in all the seats where they want to have people, and in particular, folk who they would like in seats that they hope they're going to win. And from the Conservative perspective, two really interesting examples in the last 24 hours. So Richard Holden, Conservative Party chairman, has been the MP in County Durham for the last 5 years, but his seat was abolished in the shake-up and redrawing of the constituencies. He's been all over the place on social media, popping up supporting Conservative campaigns left, right and centre, and until very recently did not actually have a campaign of his own, a constituency of his own, until, hey presto, with not very long to go, he ends up being the only Conservative candidate to be the Conservative candidate.
Shortlisted one.
Exactly, in Basildon and Billericay in Essex, which, as luck would have it, for Mr Holden, is one of the safest Conservative seats around. So that's that. And then we fast forward 24 hours to today, as we record on Thursday, and zoom to the other end of the UK to Aberdeenshire, and another high-profile Conservative, Douglas Ross, who I think I'm right in saying was the first Conservative, maybe even the first MP in the last Parliament to say he would stand down at the election, who has suddenly decided, with hours to spare, that no, he won't, and that he'll actually stand in an Aberdeenshire seat, which was on the last-minute lookout for a Conservative candidate, because David Duckett, who is a former minister and has been in a spinal injuries unit for quite a while, serious injury, was not standing, even though he wanted to, because, so said the party, his health was an issue. He did want to stand there, though. So it's one of those examples where you can see real, often, anger, because there was real anger amongst local Conservatives in Basildon and Billericay, where the party structures, as far as it can be seen locally, are seen to be sort of imposing chosen voices on them. And we've seen similar stuff, by the way, in Labour.
And we talked a lot about it with Labour last week. The blue suits who work for Keir Starmer, some of them turning into red princes who then end up in, safe plum seats for the party and being imposed in the last minute. And it does really hack off local parties, no question. I mean, there was the local Tory councillor said about Richard Holden, we don't know him. He's chairman of the party, but so what? What has he done for Basildon and Billericay? Nothing. And I think, it's fair to say it is not a good look for the chairman of a political party to end up on a shortlist of one in a plum safe seat in an election when it looks like there aren't very many safe seats. I mean, that is not how to keep your grassroots members happy. I think the weird thing about this to me is that the Tories had first mover advantage in this election, and they went with that first mover advantage but hadn't sorted out all of their candidates. And I think that they, you can see why Labour have had a scramble. You could see why the Tories shouldn't have had a scramble, because they're the ones who had a heads up, but they've had a scramble too. But candidate selection can often be very messy. So it's not unusual that big political parties end up in a bit of a mess. But Susanna, it is a very, very good question, and I hope we've managed to answer it at least partly. It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, I should quickly say, given that I did name a seat specifically there, that there'll be a full list of all of the candidates in Basildon and Billericay, and indeed in that corner of Aberdeenshire, once on the BBC website, once the closure of nominations comes around. I was on that point about the surprise thing, Laura. I was talking to a senior Labour bod the other day who was saying, and they were, of course, they were making a partisan point, but they were saying, how come the Conservatives seemed more surprised about this surprise election than they did?
Because only about 10 people were involved in the decision.
There is that. But yeah, particularly for the Conservatives in seats that are likely to prove stonkingly difficult for them, and have been stonkingly difficult for them even in better times for the Conservative Party. I think it's been a particular particular challenge.
What's interesting about this is you get political news stories that unfold over days and weeks, and then you get political news stories that actually unfold over decades. And in this case, the one that's unfolding over decades is MPs becoming local champions, people who solve your local problem and stand up for your local area in Parliament. And actually, for centuries, there's been an argument about whether that's what MPs are there to do or whether you're there to just be part of Parliament and part of the government or part of the opposition, and that your interest is running the entire country rather than being like a lobbyist for.
Yeah, are you place X's representative in Westminster or Westminster's representative in place X? You know, that kind of dynamic.
Go back to A-level politics and read some Edmund Burke. Or we could talk about the Green Party of England and Wales's big policy launch today, which was about the NHS in England. So they want to increase taxes on the very wealthy and corporations. They want to raise an extra £50 billion a year. £30 billion of that would go on the NHS, on hospitals and treatment, and £20 billion would go on social care. Chris, what do you make of that?
Big numbers. Just to put that 50 billion figure into proportion, as far as England's health budget is concerned, it's about 180 billion a year, and that's more than the NHS. That takes in stuff beyond the NHS, because, as you were saying, with social care. But nonetheless, it's a big number and a big proportion of a big number that the Greens are advocating. They want a new wealth tax. 1% on assets of more than 10 million, 2% on assets of more than $1 billion, and then also shifting capital gains tax so that it is in line with the current bans on income tax. So again, I guess ultimately cranking up what is more of a wealth tax than an income-based tax. And their argument, when inevitably the question comes, "Core blimey, that's one heck of a thing," is that they make the argument that would bring England in line with comparable European countries in terms of their health funding, and they make the argument that other political parties, in their view, are not willing to do enough to address what they see as a crisis in the NHS.
Do you know what's interesting to me about all of this? And we had Adrian Ramsey, one of the co-leaders on the programme on Sunday, is that the Greens are really the only party who look at the economy in a completely different way to everybody else. And I think it's one of their appeals to a certain type of voter. You know, they essentially think that we have enough resources. There is enough to go round in society. We should not, as all the other political parties want to do, be pursuing the growth of the economy as a relentless goal. They take a completely different view of the world. And that's the kind of bigger context into which all these policies sit, which is a really interesting thing. They also, though, like the other parties, have tripped up over some of their candidates, and they confirmed today that they were booting out some of their candidates who had been discovered over the last few weeks, I should say, to be expressing some pretty unpleasant anti-Semitic views online or liking tweets here and there. So they have had problems with candidates as well in the rush to be able to populate that big giant list of standing as many candidates as you can around the country.
And it's the classic smaller party problem, isn't it? They don't have the resources to screen everyone. And equally, their people aren't frontline household name politicians. So if you do a bad tweet and you're in the shadow cabinet or whatever, or you're on a senior spokesperson, or you're in the Commons, it gets noticed. If you're somebody just beetling away as an activist for one of these smaller parties, then it doesn't get noticed until the spotlight swings around to you at election time. And also the other point I was going to make about that is, I know I can't remember what my second point was.
You're like me last night.
Yeah, I know.
You're like me every day.
What was my second point? I can't remember what it was. Oh no, it's that things lurking on your website that no one noticed because people weren't looking at it in huge numbers. Like a quite controversial comment about cesarean sections for childbirth, then suddenly gets thrust into the limelight as well. And you have to take it off your website because people go, hang on.
Scrutiny, that's what it's called.
Or rationing of meat and dairy. So last weekend, before their manifesto emerged, we found in their policy document that they planned rationing of meat and dairy. But as soon as we asked Adrian Ramsey about that on the programme on Sunday, he rather rapidly said, "Oh, I don't think that'll be in the manifesto," as he suddenly realised people around the nation were thinking, what, do I have to put down my bacon sarnie? What is this? Anyway, there may be a case for that, right? If you're talking about sharing resources more fairly around the country, I'm not saying that is a bad idea, but it is clearly not the kind of idea that you would imagine British voters in enormous number would want to plump for.
Although they are, for the Greens, being very explicit about what what taxes they would raise, and actually
They
everyone
are.
else seems to be in like an auction to bid down how few taxes they could increase more generally.
Yeah, which sort of brings us to that wider point that I know we've talked about on Newscast before, but I've become conscious of as we're now a fortnight into this sort of parade of promises, and that's before we even get to the manifestos, which will start tumbling our way next week. Is that bigger picture kind of fiscal backdrop, to sound sort of momentarily pompous. In other words, whoever wins the election inherits a situation that is going to involve some really, really tricky trade-offs, particularly when you look at the Conservatives and Labour and what they are saying around taxes, and the Conservatives constantly trying to tease and tantalise Labour into accepting particular tax changes or tax freezes or whatever it might be that the Conservatives themselves are advocating. Whoever is Prime Minister after the election, looking at how they are going to firstly attempt to deliver whatever it is they promise in these manifestos coming in the coming days, but then also translate whatever sense of, if not optimism, then certainly goodwill or whatever it might amount to after an election. Might not be much of that either. How do you sort of move from that and move from all of this sort of swirl of noise of these weeks to the kind of crunching reality of what we know was the backdrop just a couple of months ago, and sure as heck will be the backdrop in a couple of months' time?
One thing, though, that I'm a bit surprised at, that both of them have chosen to go at it quite in this way, because both of them also know from their private polling that lots of members of the public aren't really in the mood to believe anything that any politician says to them about tax promises. And you just wonder, actually, is this the kind of stuff that is really going to shift anybody's view? And anyway, we digress. We could talk about this all night, and we are ramping up the time.
Yeah, but then you get to the situation where people put something in their manifesto about tax that voters don't believe at the time, but then when the person breaks the promise in Parliament when they're in power a few months later, they get criticised because they've broken their promise on tax, which was a promise no one believed anyway. Anyway, right,
Well,
let's hear from Mark in Cumbria, who's got a very good political science question.
Hello, Newscast and Electioncast gang. Mark here from Workington in Cumbria. Do you remember that ahead of the 2019 election, the phrase Workington man was used to describe the stereotypical swing voter? Should we be focused on a different seat this time? Also, thanks, team, for helping us ooze election news.
Ooh, Mark.
Oh, love that.
We love that. Isn't that terrific?
Laura, Workington Man was your era as political editor. So what's your take on that phenomenon?
Workington Man came from a think tank called Onward. Sidebar, people from Onward are now in powerful places. And one of them has been the Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff, I think, who's now standing as a candidate. But anyway, I digress. So Onward, a London-based research group think tank, came up with the phrase Workington Man, the sort of poster boy for, I suppose, the kind of northern end of Middle England, who, is terrible cliches, used to like the Labour Party, voted for Brexit, is probably into rugby league. I mean, total cliche territory. But as a voting group, was seen as completely critical. People who had been Labour for most of their life, they lived in a kind of Labour part of the world, and they might be tempted to vote for Boris Johnson's party, partly because they'd been Brexiteers, but they were interested in Boris Johnson's political offer, to use a terrible piece of political jargon. So this time, this campaign, I would say the equivalent that's been put forward by a different political research group is Whitby Woman, that wonderful seaside town on the north coast, because what we've seen in some of the research suggests that it is conservative tending women who are the ones who have potentially swung away. They're maybe older in age, they're maybe interested in the kind of socially conservative policies that we've seen the Tories already come out with. So Whitby Woman, I think, has already become this year's Workington Man. But to be honest, as everybody knows, because I'm always banging on about, I don't like cliches, and I don't like any of these kinds of terms, whether it's red wall, blue wall. Worcester Woman was the new Labour one.
Yeah.
But what it talks to is a particular group.
Basildon Man, I think, back in the 90s. Is that right?
Basildon's Man in 92. I think Basildon Man was meant to win it for the Tories in 92.
I think that's
and
right,
then in 97, Labour got Worcester Women. But now I'm sounding very old.
Mondeo Man, that was another one, wasn't it, at one point?
I just think they always sound
Mondeo
like
Man,
those skeletons that
think
they dig up
Mondeo-
in glaciers going, oh, we found such and such man who reveals that humans lived on berries.
That's right. And they're sort of both useful and unuseful, these kinds of cliches, but they are cliches. But Mark, it's fantastic to hear from a real, an actual Workington man rather than a cliched Workington man. But Mark, you didn't tell us what your politics are. I'd like to know that. Were you misrepresented by that terrible cliche or not?
Yeah, Mark, get back in touch. Email us, newscast@bbc.co.uk, although he already knows our email address because he already emailed us. I mean, it's for other people who don't know it. Now, Laura, I thought we could end where we started, go full circle and talk about D-Day. And I know that you have been delving into your own family archive.
Well, it's funny. I don't like talking about my family. I think it's bad enough for people I'm related to that I'm on TV at all. However, D-Day really made me think about one of my grandpas who landed on the 13th of June on the Normandy coast. He was one of the people in the 44th Lowland Brigade of the 15th Scottish Division. And I don't ever remember him talking about what happened, but he did write down what happened to him and his comrades. And I went and read some of it today as I saw some of those images, and like everybody else watching, I found them so moving. And I went back to some of the things that he had written down. And he wrote about the wait, and they were waiting off the coast, and then they landed on the 13th of June. And he wrote that his brigade were all volunteers. And this really stood with me. He said, the men who became soldiers, they'd all been living ordinary lives before the war. And they were farmhands, bank clerks, bus drivers, professional footballers, shop assistants, mill workers, and men of 100 other trades. And then he wrote not just about the landing, which he actually didn't write very much about, but about what happened next. Because, of course, D-Day was the beginning then of that massive push across Europe with all those Allied troops fighting on then for weeks and weeks and weeks. And he said these were his lasting memories, which I'm just going to quote from his words because I can't say it better. He said, the lasting memories of those desperate days in Normandy are little things picked out of the vast collection of memory pictures, the ghastly smell of dead cows and dead men on the Cher Road, the eternal dust, the Frenchman who lived in the little house by the Odon Bridge and refused to leave even when the mortar bombs were falling all around, the schoolhouse at Mondranville where the dinner was spoilt by a direct hit from a shell, and above all, the bliss of a long, long sleep when the battle was over. And I just was so moved by seeing that today, and it made me think of my family. And I just think it's incredible that all of these huge scenes that we see, these massive ceremonials, the huge thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were involved. But actually at the core of it, probably for everyone's family somewhere, somehow, there's someone with a connection to that extraordinary summer of 1944. And I just found it very moving.
And also the fact that that letter will exist forever in a world where so many things like come and go.
I don't remember him ever speaking about it, but it's very precious to me that he wrote it down. And today, 80 years later, I could dig it out and have a look.
Oh, Laura, thank you very much for sharing that with us.
I know I feel very self-indulgent because I don't normally ever talk about things like that, but I thought today was, for many families, a very special occasion.
Well, no, that's what makes it more special because, that's you delving into your own family past. We really appreciate it. Right, Laura, thank you very much. Shall you and I reconvene on Friday night to do an episode of Newscast after the seven-way debate on BBC One? And
we need snacks.
Yes, don't worry. I'm just already working out what takeaway we're going to get.
Takeaway? You're going to get a takeaway?
Can we have a margarita because it's a Friday night?
I've had pizza so many times this week already. I hate to confess, but so I'll get you a pizza. I might get some different cuisine. And before that, I'll be speaking to Michelle Hussein for a bonus episode of Newscast, which will be on BBC Sounds on Friday mid-morning, where, she won't reveal the questions she's going to put to them all, but she will hopefully reveal just actually what it's like standing in the spotlight, trying to wrangle all those big egos. And Chris, I'll speak to you soon. Who knows where? Who knows when?
Indeed. As if Michelle hasn't got enough on tomorrow. She's going to do Newscast as well.
It's just a casual chat amongst friends.
Well, I suppose so, yeah.
Right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.